We went to sort of the same high school. We went to the same college. You can probably guess which one. If you've gone to Christian High, you go to Calvin College back in the day. Then Dave was smarter than I was, so he went to law school. And we parted the sameness is there, sameness. Dave then, after law school, went into private practice with a firm called Linsey, Strain, and Worsfold. Worsfold. And then in '95 was appointed by the governor to serve as a judge in a vacant judgeship in the 61st District Bench. He remained there until he retired in April of this year. He was chief judge of the court for several terms. After retirement, he has returned to the same law firm, but the name is not the same anymore. It's now Bosch, Killman, and VanderWal. It says so on his shirt. Dave has been married to Sandra for 49 years. They have 5 children and 12 grandchildren, and all of them, the grandchildren, live within 2 miles of Dave's home. So you can guess what he does in his spare time. What he wrote was providing free child care for grandchildren, and golfing, and volunteer work. And that's where Dave and I have something in common again. We were on church council together. So his talk is about Hollanders and hooligans. And at our lunch table I said they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And it occurred to me this bank robbery was in 1933. And think of that in the context of our morning talk, for those of you who were here. People were poor. What do you do when you're poor? Maybe you rob a bank. Excuse me. So Dave will have us look at the context in which the robberies occurred and the efforts by the fledgling FBI and underfunded law enforcement. In particular, we will learn details about this great Grand Haven bank robbery and learn about the locals who refused to roll over for some of the most notorious and violent bank robbers of the era. And we'll examine the post-robbery legal environment that led to the conviction and imprisonment of a man who had never been to Grand Haven. This is the sometimes amusing story of these Hollanders and hooligans. Dave, it's all yours.
All right. Is this working? It seems to be. Well, thank you, Jan. And I am happy to be here. I didn't know I was on your list for that long. And it's not as if I turned down an invitation. To my knowledge, this is my first invite for this, so I'm happy to be here. I did park in the lot next door that said for permit parking only. And I said to the lady who was tending the parking area that I was giving a speech at the Seidman Center, and she said, well, you're going to need a permit. I said, well, I don't have one. And so what we agreed on is that I would park my car right next to her booth, and if anyone came to try to tow it or ticket it, she would take care of it. But I may need a ride home. Jan has been a good friend for a number of years. And in preparing for this meeting today, we talked with each other by email and by phone. And during the email conversations, we found out that we aren't on the same page politically. And what was fun about it is that it doesn't affect anything about our friendship. And I mentioned to a friend I was talking with last night that I had talked to Jan and that we found out we had a few political disagreements. And I said, you know, if only our elected officials could respond in the same way we do, we're still good friends and we still communicate. But that's another topic for another occasion. This story began for me in 1972 when I was walking the streets of Grand Haven with a blonde I was dating. And she ended up being my wife. She lived in Grand Haven, and we walked down Main Street, and she said, look at this bank. Look at this one. And she showed me that there were bullet pockmarks all over the exterior of the bank. I said, obviously, what in the world is that from? And she said, I don't know all the details, but I do know that there was a bank robbery here. And it was a major bank robbery. And even more significantly for me, the sheriff at the time was her grandfather. I remember that story, but I couldn't do much about it because I was just getting into law school shortly after that, raising a number of children, working. Who has time for this sort of thing? And so it had to wait for us to become empty nesters. But, probably 10, 15 years ago now, I started dabbling in it, got into several FBI files through the Freedom of Information Act, and what captivated me right at the outset was frequent communication between my wife's grandfather and J. Edgar Hoover. And I thought, this is a cool story. This needs more work. And so, through a lot of research, a lot of phone conversations with relatives of the players that we're going to talk about, it became a bit of a fun project and a hobby for me. I think to get into the context of what took place on August 18, 1933, we first have to talk about the culture at that time. There's a reason why there were Depression-era bank robbers. And keep in mind, when we talk about the Depression-era and Depression-era bank robbers, and you've heard the big names, Dillinger, Karpus, Pretty Boy Floyd, all of those names are famous names that we tend to think of covering a long period of time. We're really only talking about roughly an 18-month period of time when these bank robberies occurred. We need to understand then the factors that encouraged these robberies. The 21st Amendment repealed prohibition in 1933, but even before the repeal of prohibition, the gangster era, largely in Chicago, was on the wane. This gentleman, anybody? Al Capone, was in prison for, of all things, tax evasion. And he was out of the picture by this time. He himself, in all likelihood, had gutted the North Side gang of Bugs Moran in 1929 through the famous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Now, I say that gutted that gang. Yes, it took out several key players. But significantly, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre represented a change in public perception of what was going on, largely in Chicago, with bootlegging and other underworld activities. This type of violence was more than the public could handle. And so that bootlegging era gangster was largely on the wane, but the loss of one industry opens up another industry. And so these individuals are not at that point going to say, hey, I think I might go into the ministry. That didn't happen. Instead, they found, hey, bank robberies. Secondly, another factor that encouraged this type of behavior at that time was that bank robbery itself and interstate flight was not a federal crime as it is today. Bank robbery was handled by local jurisdictions, which led to the types of things that you've probably seen in some of these older movies with the robber driving a car, heading for the border, the police in hot pursuit, they reach the border, end of story. The local authorities did not have jurisdiction beyond their boundaries. And so there was no federalization of bank robbery at that time. And so the bank robbers had the fast cars. They often had far superior weaponry, and they had that benefit of the boundary to protect them. And then, finally, we don't, at this point in time, have what we think of today as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What we had was this very fledgling organization known as the Bureau of Investigation. They had very little authority. And as we already saw, the legislation didn't help them. It wasn't until 1934 that the federal crime bill was actually enacted, which gave the then Bureau of Investigation arresting authority, authority to carry and use weapons. But at this point, this time in 1933 that we're talking about, the Bureau of Investigation was just that. It was just investigatory. Local authorities would perhaps send fingerprints to Washington and say, can you match these up to someone? But as far as being a really powerful law enforcement agency, it wasn't there yet. You can see from this photograph, they weren't too heavy on diversity either. Names like Melvin Purvis and played by, who's the name of the actor? Yeah. Yes. In Public Enemies. Yeah, Melvin Purvis became a big name in history. A huge name in the history of the FBI, and his interaction with Hoover became famous. But at this point, he, along with everybody else, is just getting started, trying to figure out, first of all, how they're going to get legislation enacted to give them the power they needed. And then secondly, even once they get that legislation, how are you going to convince Congress to fund our efforts? And then, of course, J. Edgar Hoover. Brand new on the job. Really disliked by Congress. Supported by the president, who was concerned about the effect that these bank robberies were having on local communities. But there's this constant battle between Hoover and FDR trying to get appropriations through Congress. That's the context that encouraged these types of Depression-era bank robberies. Why specifically was Grand Haven the target? What about Grand Haven, and in particular this bank on the corner of Washington and 3rd, that became attractive in August of 1933. Well, first of all, its close proximity to the remnants of the Chicago-era bootlegging thugs. Many of them set up along the southern shore of Lake Michigan in communities around Michigan City, Long Beach. We'll find that Long Beach plays a big role in our story here. But many of them had essentially been driven out of the city limits of Chicago to areas along the lake shore, obviously in close proximity to towns like Grand Haven. There was the perception also that Grand Haven law enforcement was like any small town law enforcement, unable to stand up to the weaponry, to the vehicles, to the planning of these Depression-era bank robbers. And then also, Grand Haven became a target because Holland was a target. In 1932, the First State Bank in Holland was hit by an individual known as Ed Bentz, B-E-N-T-Z. We're going to hear about him more in a moment because he's a player in Grand Haven. But he had participated in a very successful robbery in Holland about a year earlier that netted $73,000, which was a huge take at that time. It went very smoothly, without a hitch. The same should have happened in Grand Haven. So the game plan. How do we get this plan to hit Grand Haven? Who's involved? Before we get to Grand Haven, we need to go to Long Beach, Indiana. That's a few miles east of Michigan City. Long Beach was formed in 1921. It was a community formed in direct response to the bawdy corruption of Chicago. This is where Chicago wealth could move along the lake shore for summer retreats from the mess that Chicago had become. Long Beach, as I said, was formed in 1921, and they put together a very self-serving promotional campaign. The literature described Long Beach as America's finest country home and community playground. It featured this community pool with a wild Roman plunge. It featured Long Beach Country Club, which was built at the same time and still exists. And it also claimed that, quote, young boys and girls who summer at Long Beach will have their young lives molded for future successful activities. What a claim. Although, Chief Justice John Roberts, United States Supreme Court Chief Justice, spent his elementary school years in Long Beach, to some extent supporting the claim. Long Beach, also they stated, is easily reached and easily enjoyed by every member of the family, no matter what may be his inclinations. Well, the inclinations for Ed Bentz to visit Long Beach in 1933 were nothing like what the Chamber of Commerce envisioned. Bentz was, like other Depression-era robbers, attracted by the seclusion of the shoreline, by the privacy of the country club. He loved to golf, but in part because he was one of America's most wanted bank robbers. He and his wife, Verna, needed a retreat close to the action of Chicago in case he decided to get back into the business of bank robbery, but also isolated from the at least increasingly longer arm of the Bureau of Investigation. So, in the early summer of 1933, they moved into a lakefront cottage at Long Beach. Ed's stated purpose at that time, and this may have been wife Verna talking more than Ed, but the purpose was to get back into this fledgling toy distribution business he had been involved with at one time before he decided to become a bank robber. He decided he was going to get into an honest business. He was respected in the bank robbery industry because of the detail. J. Edgar Hoover himself at one time called him the best of the worst. He was a wanted man, though, and he was tired of running, and he laid low, and his intentions were good until in the late June of 1933, he agreed to meet with an individual for breakfast in Burns Harbor, which is just down the road, as you know. The friend who set up the meeting showed up with a mop-haired kid named Lester Gillis. They did not talk about a toy distribution business. Bence talked with this individual, Gillis, and Gillis peppered Bence with questions about the Bence method of robbing banks. He seemed so interested in getting involved in that business. Bence then suggested that Gillis could rent the cottage that was adjacent to his own at Long Beach, and their unholy alliance was formed. Over the next week, Gillis brought several contacts from the Chicago area into the Long Beach area, and these would be contacts who were involved in various levels of crime, including bootlegging in Chicago that Gillis knew. They all discussed getting back into robbing banks, and they discussed Grand Haven. Bence learned through these discussions that Gillis had been involved in some robberies around the Midwest, including a bank or two, but he was unaware of the wild, almost psychotic personality that Gillis demonstrated when he would participate in these robberies. Had he known that, had he prepared in the way Bence normally prepared, he never would have gotten involved with this guy named Gillis. Bence had no way of knowing that his new friend's crazed behavior would one day earn Gillis the label as public enemy number one. Lester Gillis, nowadays, is better recognized by his alias, Babyface Nelson. That meeting in Burns Harbor, a simple breakfast meeting, would forever link Long Beach, Indiana, with Grand Haven, Michigan. So, let's take a look at the players. First of all, the bad guys. And, of course, Babyface Nelson. Nelson was only 25 at the time that this meeting took place. He had been placed in a reformatory at age 8 for accidentally shooting a playmate in the face. He stole from stores, he stole from banks, he even stole jewelry from the wife of Chicago's mayor, Big Bill Thompson. The wife, the victim of the theft, described her thief as having a baby face, and thus the nickname. Tommy Carroll was a boxer with a crooked nose. He was a thief and had done time for various crimes before being paroled and then eventually hooking up with Nelson. He was 32. Earl Doyle had been involved in robberies with Nelson, often in the St. Paul, Minnesota area, which is another area other than just outside of Chicago. But St. Paul, Minnesota was a heavy area for these bank robbers to congregate and commit their crimes. Chuck Fisher, another one of the bad guys, had worked with Nelson on various robberies, but was relatively inexperienced at the time of the Grand Haven robbery. He was 28. And then there was another person that history has not been able to clearly identify. Most sources say his name was simply Freddie, last name unknown. Some sources I found called him Freddie Monahan. What was known of all the odd things is that he had only 3 fingers on his right hand. And the calculating Bents, upon meeting him, decided he was better equipped to drive the getaway car with only 3 fingers on the right hand rather than handling a Tommy gun. Those were the bad guys. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because you will read accounts of the Grand Haven robbery, and you will see some accounts will tell you that Dillinger was there. If I could present this story and honestly claim that Dillinger was there, I would do it. I would love to add Dillinger to the mix here. But he wasn't there. I am convinced of that. I think if you read that Dillinger was in Grand Haven, it may be a Grand Haven local who's trying to make the story even better. But he was not there. What about the good guys? The bank employees themselves have to be listed as the good guys. 4 males, 2 females. The most noteworthy for our story were Vice President of the bank, Ted Bolt, who is seen on the left here, and a cashier by the name of Art Welling. Ed Bents had taken stock of the bank personnel prior to the robbery itself by going into the bank and simply casing the place. Who's working? Who seems steady-handed? Who seems like the type who might react and try to become a hero? He should have been more concerned about this bank teller, Art Welling. Welling was already a bit of a town hero, a town legend, before the day of the robbery. He wore number 59 for the Michigan football team, and in 1927 played in the first game ever at a huge new stadium that would eventually, ironically, become known as the Big House. Kind of ironic for our story. Bents should have trusted his instincts when he noticed Weller and was concerned about him. So the bank employees were factors that Bents could evaluate, and he could plan for that. What he could not prepare for and could not anticipate was the owner of the furniture store next door. There was a furniture store immediately east of the bank, and the vice president of that was a guy by the name of Ed Kinkema. He's the other individual you see in this photograph. Ed Kinkema not only ran the furniture store, but ironically was the town mortician. Kinkema was familiar with shootouts, and in particular with bank robberies. In 1932, Kinkema was in a bank in Lansing when, as a customer, when an unhappy bank employee came in and shot up the place. an individual was killed in that shootout. Kinkema was uninjured, but from his spot hiding under a table, he was struck by how long it took law enforcement to respond to the scene. And so he returns to Grand Haven and gets together with his cousin, who is the bank vice president, Ted Bull. And the two of them devised an elaborate alarm system plan. The idea was that if there was anything going on in the bank that was not supposed to be going on, bank employees could trigger a foot alarm. That foot alarm would signal the employees of the furniture store right next door. And you're thinking, hey, why not have this signal just go to law enforcement? Well, it did, but they wanted to have a first responder, and they wanted that to be the furniture store owner at Kinkema. That plan, as we're going to see in a moment, would completely catch the master planner, Ed Bentz, off guard. The sheriff at the time, my wife's grandfather, was Ben Rozema. He and Deputy Maurice Rozema, along with Grand Haven Police Chief Lawrence DeWitt, were the key law enforcement officials who were involved in this case, not only at that time, but for years to come. And we'll see why they had to stay involved well after this occurred. Rozema was tough, as you can see from this photograph, but very fair-minded. He took personal interest in the inmates at his jail, trying to get to know them and steering them toward a better life. And it is well known that inmates who didn't present a security risk were invited to accompany Rozema for Sunday worship services. His wife, Elizabeth, she's the, well, we'll just say attractive woman in the front row there, would prepare home-cooked meals for the inmates, which the sheriff would then deliver to the inmates. And so they operated sort of an Andy Taylor Aunt B before we even knew of Mayberry. So that brings us to game day. August 18, 1933. A few days before the robbery, a powerful, brand new 8-cylinder Buick was stolen in Chicago and delivered to Bentz. Legend connects the theft of that vehicle to Father Charles Coughlin, and that may be a name that some of you are familiar with through history. He was a loudmouth radical. He was a thorn in the side of FDR, who I understand you heard about this morning. FDR wanted desperately to somehow get rid of this bothersome, annoying Father Coughlin. He attacked the federal government, he attacked Jews, he attacked banks, he attacked capitalism, all through this newsletter that he published and through radio broadcasts. The FBI watched him very closely because Hoover did not believe that Coughlin's association with gangsters and robbers was simply to minister to the lost. Hoover believed that a man of the cloth was an effective tool for these Depression-era bank robbers when it became time to launder money or get a new vehicle. I mean, who's not going to sell a new vehicle to a man of the cloth? Again, I have found no reliable evidence linking Coughlin on this motor vehicle, this theft, to this case. That's not to say it couldn't have happened. What is clear from the FBI files is that in the aftermath of the robbery, there is almost a never-ending effort to somehow link this Coughlin to the theft of that motor vehicle. Never quite accomplished, however. And so Friday, August 18, 1933, was a beautiful summer Friday afternoon. Freddie, three fingers, pulled the Buick to the west side of 3rd Street, facing south, just south of Washington. The tension probably caused him to grab that steering wheel even tighter with all three of his fingers. He remained in the vehicle while the other 5 approached the bank from different directions, eventually entering as the employees pondered the approaching weekend. Quality of these photographs is not good, I understand that, but that at least shows the bank as it actually existed at that time. The employees were ordered to the floor as the 5 entered. 2 of the robbers covered the front and rear doors. The remaining 3 targeted the 2 teller cages that you see in these photographs and the vault. Art Welling, the football player, stalled a bit as he opened the vault, feigning inability to remember the combination. He was simply trying to buy some time, as he had already activated the silent foot alarm, the brainchild of Ted Bolt and Ed Kinkema. The foot alarm was, of course, silent in the bank, but was heard clearly by Kinkema, who quickly swung into action. Kinkema, in first response to the alarm, confirmed that it was no false alarm when he glanced at the bank and saw that the curtains were closed, but it was not yet closing time. He knew something was going on. Kinkema and a fellow employee grabbed their already loaded shotguns and swung into action. Kinkema snuck through the bushes behind the bank and noticed a person in the front seat of a large Buick parked along the side of the road. I'm not sure whether he noticed that the person had 3 fingers, but the person did duck his head, which Kinkema thought unusual. He suspected that was the getaway car. Now, as we go through the rest of this story, you're going to hear that Kinkema became a town hero. And are there any relatives of Ed Kinkema here? I gave this speech once at LaGrave Church, and I never meant to make fun of him. But this guy was a cowboy. I think he lived for this moment. And when you look at the accounts in the Grand Haven Tribune after the robbery, and I'll give you some of those, this guy absolutely loved it. He loved being the hero, and he truly was a hero. And so I don't mean to in any way criticize him, but when I did speak at LaGrave, someone came up to me afterwards and said, "I'm a niece of Ed Kinkman." Okay, well, he was a hero. I mean, there's nothing negative to say about him other than he certainly played the moment well. The accounts vary as to what he said to Freddie in the getaway car as he walked up to the car. But one account that Kinkema gave to the Grand Haven Tribune, I think, clearly shows that this guy's moment had arrived. The Tribune says, according to Kinkema, that Kinkema walked up, put a gun to Freddie's head and said, "You are not welcome in my town." I just love that. Meanwhile, inside the bank, as the robbers gathered the loot, Nelson shouted rank rank, which was a signal to the others that they were in trouble, that they had been discovered, that the streets were no longer empty. The five gathered what they could and rushed through the rear door, only to be greeted, get this, baby-faced Nelson, Ed Bentz, famous robbers. As they hit the rear door, they're greeted by a hail of gunfire from the local mortician. The robbers now take cover and head back in the bank trying to figure out what to do. Nelson, as he would do in just about every robbery he was involved with, went to that back door and just sprayed the streets with his Tommy gun, just indiscriminately firing away. By now, Deputy Sheriff Maurice Rosamond, my wife's uncle, had arrived, along with Grand Haven police officers and many bystanders. The robbers decided the solution to get out of this mess was to grab several of the bank employees and use them essentially as a human shield. They exited the rear door, and even Kinkma at that point realized that when there are townspeople and bank employees being used as human shields, you better hold off firing your gun. What remained of the robbers' rapidly disintegrating plan went from bad to worse when they discovered that Freddie had left town. Freddie was gone, the Buick was gone, the getaway plan was gone, everything they needed was gone, and they were on foot. Shots continued to be fired by both the good guys and bad guys, but the risk of harm to the hostages limited the options for Kinkma and law enforcement. One of the robbers, Earl Doyle, and you can almost predict the outcome of what happens next by looking at his forehead. One of the robbers, Earl Doyle, held Bank Vice President Ted Bolt at gunpoint. So Bolt, Kinkma's cousin, is held at gunpoint by Earl Doyle, who's one of the robbers. Doyle is waiting for further instructions from Ed Bentz as to how to get out of this mess. We can only assume that Bolt was emboldened by the actions of his cousin. Bolt was a mild-mannered bank vice president, but he decided, perhaps inspired by Kinkma, to grab Doyle's shotgun. The two of them get involved in what was literally a life and death struggle. And, predictably, Doyle, the robber, gains control. He is standing over Bolt, ready to blow him away, when Doyle receives a blow to the head that disengages him from the gun that he's holding and knocks him to the ground. And guess who delivered that blow? Kinkma. Kinkma sees his cousin in mortal danger and swings into action and saves his life. And the Grand Haven Tribune, in their post-robbery article, interviews Kinkma and asks him, what did you do then? Once you had saved Bolt's life, what did you do with Doyle? What did you do with the robber? And he said, I held him at gunpoint with a smile on my face. He loved the moment. Lori Bonema and a Mrs. Miller decided to take advantage of a perfect August afternoon that same day. They decided to take a trip to the beach with their children. Bonema drove her Chevrolet west on Franklin, south of the bank, when she stopped to observe a ruckus on 3rd Street. A moment later, the two ladies were staring at 2 Tommy guns as the robbers, absent now Freddie and Doyle, took over the Chevrolet. They used a few bank employees as well as the ladies themselves and the 2 children as a shield. The robbers' only goal at this point is just to get out of here. The car was driven a short distance south on 3rd Street. The robbers held the screaming hostages at gunpoint while standing on the running boards in a scene you can imagine from movies you've seen. The shooting stopped. The hostages and the 2 women begged for their safety and that of their children, and they were all released unharmed. The Chevy sped away, occupied by the 4 remaining confused bank robbers. That same day, Grand Rapids resident Oscar Varno and his wife had rented a cottage on Lake Michigan. They were expecting a few weeks of relaxation. That afternoon, the 2 of them with their dog took a trip out into the country south of Grand Haven and stopped at a farm to purchase some strawberries. Oscar's wife and dog waited in the large Chrysler while Oscar went in to purchase the strawberries. When Oscar returned to his car, it was surrounded by 4 armed gunmen who had just discovered that the Bonham Chevrolet had less than a gallon of gas in it, and they needed different transportation. Obviously, they took over the Chrysler, leaving Oscar and his wife and his dog. Later, again in the post-robbery aftermath, the Grand Haven Tribune interviewed Oscar Varno about this incident. And we can only assume it was the pressure of the moment that caused him to answer in the way he answered. But he was asked by the reporter, "What did you say when you came out and saw these robbers surrounding your car with your wife and dog in it?" And he answered, "I said to them, 'Please let my dog go.'" We can only assume, and I don't know because this is not reported, but we can only assume things were a little frosty on that vacation. The robbers sped off in their Chrysler heading east, but without the detailed getaway plan. They had a getaway plan that was going to take them 450 miles, a route of diversion all the way to Adrian and then on back, 450 miles to essentially cover a route that is about 100 miles along the lakeshore. All part of the master plan, but all blowing up. They got to Adrian when the tire on the Chrysler of Varno's blew. And so one more quick car theft, they had a vehicle, and they eventually got back to Long Beach the next morning. Now, what about the aftermath? What about the scene in Grand Haven after the robbery occurs? Miraculously, and I don't use that word just flippantly, but miraculously, nobody died in this shooting. A bystander suffered significant gunshot wounds to the back and was the most seriously injured person, but recovered. Doyle, the captured robber, had a broken leg, a gunshot wound to the hand, and of course the head injury inflicted by Killman. Other locals experienced less significant gunshot wounds. The story of Killman's heroics spread quickly and made the Tribune's headlines. And you can see below his photograph there, Bolt owes life to Ed Kinkema. And you've got to believe he loved reading the Grand Haven Tribune that day. That story includes, again, an interview with Kinkema, and the legend grew increasingly, even within the first 24 hours post-robbery. They asked Kinkema what he did after the robbery, after everything was cleared out of town. He said, I did have to report to the hospital to have, quote, a bit of buckshot removed from my forehead. You know, as if he had a sliver removed or something. The minutes and hours after the robbery had law enforcement organizing searches for the robbers and evidence of the crime. Citizens assisted at the church, including for purposes of you historians, the crew of the Coast Guard cutter Escanaba, which was anchored in the channel. The Escanaba, as you historians probably know, was blown up by a German torpedo in 1943 while escorting supply ships, killing all but 2 of its crew members. And so it is probable that at least some of those crew members had searched for bank robbers 10 years earlier. The Tribune reported that some cash was scattered on the streets during the robbers' getaway. Some was kept by the locals as souvenirs. It was reported that an elderly woman found $2.71 and returned it to the bank because, as she said, it doesn't belong to me. Estimates on the actual take from this disaster vary. Probably approximately $2,500 in cash, maybe another $5,000 in bonds and traveler's checks, but a mere pittance compared to the expectations. The getaway Buick was discovered the next day hidden in a heavily wooded area near Pigeon Lake. And again, some of you know where that is. Still holding all the tools of the trade, including the sack lunches, the getaway plan, some weapons. From that car, excuse me, this was one of the weapons that was recovered. And you can see that is a fairly modern picture. That wasn't a picture at the scene. I'm not going to say who has that weapon. It's not me. But it comes out every few years, and I think this is every 5 years, that the town of Grand Haven does this sort of reenactment of the robbery, and then the weapon makes an appearance at that time. Interestingly, at the time of the robbery, Sheriff Rosema and Grand Haven Police Chief DeWitt were both out of town. Rosema was transporting a prisoner, and DeWitt was at the Ionia Free Fair. The Tribune, and you know, I guess politics maybe never changes, but the Tribune published an editorial shortly after the robbery, and I pulled that editorial and read it, and I mean, this is from 1933, but I sort of got mad for my wife's grandpa that he was absolutely lambasted in this editorial for not being in town. As if, hey, you should have anticipated Nelson was going to be in Grand Haven that day. Earl Doyle was captured at the scene, as you saw. He pleaded guilty to robbery on September 9, 1933, and was sentenced to life in prison at Jackson. He was paroled in 1947, and at age 47 moved to San Antonio. Chuck Fisher later pleaded guilty to a string of robberies in Minnesota and Wisconsin, some while working with Dillinger. He was released from prison in 1942 at age 43. Tommy Carroll became a key player in Dillinger's gang, which primarily operated in later 33 and into 34. That's when Dillinger was at his heyday. Carroll avoided capture, but was killed in a shootout with police in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He was 33. You can see longevity was not a big deal for bank robbers. Babyface Nelson also eventually hooked up with Dillinger, and their often tense relationship is depicted in the movie Public Enemies. And maybe some of you have seen that movie, and it's worth watching. Brian Burrow is the author of the book upon which the movie is based, but Burrow has so much detail, and if you read the book or watch the movie, you'll see some of that detail. The movie is not quite accurate in many ways, predictably, but the book is a good read. And certainly, in the book and in the movie, you'll see that Dillinger and Nelson, Dillinger thought that Nelson was just absolutely nuts and that he was a real liability to their operation. And he was probably right. Nelson was eventually killed in a shootout near Barrington, Illinois in November of 1934. So right after Dillinger was killed on the streets of Chicago, Nelson was killed in Barrington, but in the process, 2 agents were killed. Nelson, with all the history, was 26 years old. Ed Vince, the mastermind, was finally arrested in Brooklyn, New York in 1936. At that time, he was 41 years old. He was sentenced to 25 years for an unrelated bank robbery. And at the time of his sentencing, it's interesting, he asked the judge, "Would you please send me to Alcatraz because that's where all my friends are." He confessed to the Holland and to the Grand Haven robbery, but was never charged as he had already been sentenced on these other ones. He died in Tacoma, Washington in 1979 at the age of 83. Freddie, 3 fingers, died August 21, 1933. And you're thinking, how can that be? That's 3 days after the robbery. I don't know how accurate this is, but I've read several accounts that this is how Freddie died. And it seems to fit the personality of the person who killed him. 3 days after the robbery, Freddie answered a knock at the door of his Chicago apartment. As he opened the door, a man jumped out of the bushes and put a single bullet in his brain. As Freddie fell, Nelson said, "You don't run from your friends." Nelson then sent a short wire to Ed Bent saying simply, "Freddie is no more." Again, Freddie's last name and age at death are unknown. Now, I could end the story right here, and it would have been worth my time to play with some history and research it, and I hope it would have been worth your time to hear the story. But from the perspective of a person who has worked in the courts their entire career, there remains one more story from all of this that needs to be told. And that is the story or the chapter that I simply called The Innocent Man. So we've talked a little bit about the context in which this robbery occurred. We know that Hoover needed some success. FDR needed some success in this fight against bank robbery. Hoover needed it to justify the existence of the FBI. And so you see all of this communication between my wife's grandpa and J. Edgar Hoover post-robbery, trying to identify who else was involved. I mean, I told you who history tells us is involved, but at the time, they didn't have those names. They had Doyle, but that's all they had. Everyone else was gone. And although they didn't get away with much, here comes 6 of them on that day. 5 of them are gone. The townspeople had been heroic. There's no question about that. And they had largely defeated this robbery attempt. And Kinkama had been well established as one tough mortician. But there was only Doyle to show for it, and Hoover needed more. And so, post-robbery, we see many of these wanted posters going up and these communications between various police agencies, first of all relating to Ed Betts, because he was certainly a suspect based on the description. Ed Betts was wanted. But he was not arrested until 1936, as I said, in Vermont for an unrelated robbery. Finally, in a huge break, the feds uncovered evidence that some of the stolen traveler's checks had been passed in southern Michigan and northern Indiana by an individual named Ted Benz, Ed's brother. And we can assume Pa and Ma Benz didn't have much imagination for creative names, but in any event, we have Ted and Ed. Ed was clearly the mastermind of the whole operation. Ted, post-robbery, passed some of the stolen traveler's checks and bonds in northern Indiana and was linked to that. So they had a name. They had a name to work with, Ted Benz. Hoover sent pictures of Ted Benz to Grand Haven. And this is where we need to look at the legal context in what happens next. We need to look at how things can go wrong legally when the rules of law were different almost 100 years ago. Hoover sent pictures of Ted Benz to Grand Haven, and Sheriff Roseman, I'm not criticizing him, he did what was done at that time. Gathered all the bank employees, probably around a table about like this, and they're all there together. And here's the picture of Ted Benz. Does that look like him? Yes, 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 yes. Of course. They're all going to feed off each other. And in fact, it's probably an honest answer to the question. Ted is Ed's brother. But that was enough to get the ball rolling. And the ball was rolling against Ted Benz. Ted was arrested in Portland, Maine in August of 1934, so a year after the bank robbery. He was arrested by a Portland, Maine police officer, aware that the bank, local law enforcement, had authorized a reward for the arrest of Ted Benz. So the officer, and this is in the archives at the Grand Haven Library, which is a great place to visit, by the way, if you're ever interested in something like this or any other history. They're very helpful. There's a letter in there that was written by this Portland, Maine police officer who captures Ted Benz and says, okay, here's what I did. I want the reward. There is a $100 reward for his capture, after all. And not only does it say why he, that police officer, should get that reward, but he criticizes the efforts of a fellow police officer who also applied for the reward, saying the fellow police officer really didn't do much, I did all the work. Greed post-robbery. Ted was not particularly surprised that Grand Haven wanted him. He had passed this stolen merchandise, that's true. But he wasn't all that concerned about it either, because he knew that Hoover was not interested in the aftermath. He didn't care who passed this stuff. Hoover needed big-name bank robbers, not those who laundered the loot. He was eventually lodged in the Ottawa County Jail and positively identified by the bank employees who walked past his cell. Again, line them all up, walking past the cell. Does that look like him? Yes. Those identifications and passing the stolen property made the stakes much higher for Ted Bitts because he was charged with the robbery itself. Even then, Ted was not particularly worried because he knew exactly where he was on August 18, 1933, and it was not Grand Haven. Ted and his common-law wife, Christine, had arrived in Chicago on August 14, 1933, and they were there to take in the wonders of the World's Fair, the century of progress that some of you may have read about. They wanted a glimpse into the future of science and technology. They saw the latest wonders in rail travel, automobiles, and even at the World's Fair there was a cigarette-smoking robot. Ted took out a lease for 1 week on a small apartment on Luella Avenue in Chicago. And I'm giving this detail because it comes out at the trial. The lease ran from August 16 to August 24. The apartment was a mess, and the landlord agreed to have the carpeting cleaned. And so a person by the name of Lonnie Bailey came in and cleaned the carpeting on August 18, 1933. Ted helped him to reduce the amount of rent he had to pay. During that same afternoon, Ted took a break to visit the drugstore, which was right next door. The druggist, Aaron Shugan, prepared a concoction for Ted to give to his wife, who wasn't feeling well. As he walked back to the apartment, Ted saw a Chicago Police Department police officer, and the two of them struck up a conversation. The police officer's name was John Campbell. They talked about the fair, and Officer Campbell could see that Ted was interested in technology. So he asked Ted to sit in his cruiser and showed him how the police radio communication system worked. Ted had a busy day on August 18, 1933, all while the bank was being robbed in Grand Haven. His trial went quickly for such a serious charge. There was only 1 day of testimony on a bank robbery charge. Predictably, the bank employees testified that, yes, Ted was in the bank. He was described as the robber with the straw hat. Their testimony was predictably consistent, in part because the defense attorney, by the name of Parsons, amazingly never asked that the witnesses be sequestered. In other words, separated so that one witness cannot hear what another witness said. They all watched each other testify and all heard each other testify. Parsons agreed that Ted had received some of the loot, laundered it, even knew where some of it was hidden. And if you want to spend some spare time on the Michigan-Indiana border near US 12, there's still a map that shows the spot, and people will still go to that area and hunt for what is obviously not there. That was essentially the case presented by the prosecution. Witnesses who were town heroes, presenting evidence to a jury of townspeople who knew their city had been invaded and that something had to be done. The defense presented by Parsons, the defense attorney, was essentially an alibi defense. I couldn't have done it because I wasn't there. It included the testimony of the carpet cleaner, the druggist, his wife, Christine, Ted's wife, attempted to testify briefly about the story that she had heard about Ted being with the police officer. But the police officer, rather that testimony was excluded as hearsay, as it properly should have been excluded. Amazing. And there's no explanation in the trial transcript, and I've read through the whole transcript. There's no explanation as to why Officer John Campbell is not present at trial. I mean, imagine if you have an alibi defense, it's one thing to present the carpet cleaner, but to present a Chicago police officer in uniform to say, no, this guy was with me. Wow. You think that would create reasonable doubt in the mind of a jury? Certainly it would. But he wasn't there. Even the battered, captured, and convicted Earl Doyle, okay, made a return visit to Grand Haven for the trial. He acknowledged his role in the robbery, but would not name any accomplices. But what he did testify to under oath was that he had never seen Ted Bence in his entire life until that day. Perhaps the jury would have discredited Doyle's testimony even without the instructions of the presiding judge, Judge Miles. Doyle was, after all, a convicted bank robber. Don't bank robbers all stick together? The jury could have said, no, we're not buying into that. But listen to what Judge Miles instructed the jury as to how they were to treat the testimony of Doyle. Miles said in his closing instructions, now, regarding Mr. Doyle, another witness who, as you understand, imprisoned in the state prison of Jackson, one of the men who took part in the robbing of this bank. He testified here that the defendant was not one of those who took part in the robbery. He refuses to give the names of any of those who did take part of the robbery. And it would appear to me that his testimony is not entitled to great weight. Ted Bence did not testify at his trial, and that was probably strategically a good move by the defense attorney, because Ted's prior dealings with all of this stolen property would have been admissible in evidence to impeach his credibility. Ted was quickly convicted by the all-male jury and was immediately sentenced to life in prison. He wept bitterly while hearing his sentence, which was imposed. Some of you involved in law know about the pre-sentence process and sentencing recommendations. It was imposed right then, right there, while the jury was still there. They all observed Ted proclaim his innocence. And as he was led away, he turned to the jury and said, all I've got to say is that I am innocent of this offense. And it will be on your conscience, boys, all your lives. I never robbed this bank, and it will be proven sooner or later. That is all I had to say. Well, again, the story could end here. And we would have a not particularly uncommon convicted defendant saying, I was set up, I didn't do it, okay? And it wouldn't be particularly unusual. But this is when it starts to get unusual, if you didn't think it was unusual before. While imprisoned in both Marquette and Jackson, Ted continued to advocate for himself. He first exhausted all of his appellate remedies, but then gets involved in a long series of elaborate communication with FBI agents Conroy and Lynch. These communications are included in the FBI records that I reviewed. And it's not a convicted defendant bothering an agent and the agent then saying, hey, leave me alone. You had your justice, go away. No, it's like friends going back and forth. The agents responded with often very lengthy letters, even offering to assist Ted in future parole hearings. In other words, there was some sense by at least some people in law enforcement that he had been wrongfully convicted. Many of the letters read like communications between best friends. Often they included small talk about the war effort, the weather, fishing. Ted frequently asked Conroy and Lynch to convey Ted's compliments to Hoover for the fine job he's doing. Ted engaged attorneys to advocate on his behalf, and one of these names might be familiar with you. He was a former Kent County Circuit Court Judge, George Cook. He advocated on Ted's behalf and communicated directly with J. Edgar Hoover. Ted's brother Ed Bentz, the mastermind, met with agents Conroy and Lynch while he was in Atlanta being held for transfer to Alcatraz. He gave a detailed written statement, he being Ed, that Ted was not involved with the robbery and that, quote, he lacked the guts to wave a gun in anyone's face. Eventually, one of the strongest advocates on behalf of Ted Bentz and his innocence was Grand Haven Mayor Claude Verdun. A man of strong principles, Verdun risked all political capital by declaring that Ted was wrongly convicted. Now, again, think in terms of the context here. The town has been overrun by these thugs. Doyle was the only one convicted until Ted Bentz. Now at least we had two. We have something to show for it through the efforts of the town heroes, the bank employees. And the mayor of that town was saying, whoa, wait a minute. This guy didn't do it. And not only did he say he didn't do it, he acted upon his beliefs. The mayor and his wife frequently visited Ted in prison, both in Jackson and then ultimately in Marquette. They exchanged fishing stories, and the mayor assisted Ted in the publication of Ted's fishing articles in various outdoor magazines. The mayor's wife would knit items for Ted and bring them to prison. I did have a conversation with the mayor's son, and it was a fascinating conversation. And he was very willing to talk to me because he was very proud of his dad, and rightfully so. And I said, what can you tell me about this? What was really going on? He simply said that his dad was a man of strong conviction and that he knew that Ted had not committed this robbery. The son, and in conjunction with his dad, eventually convinced the Muskegon Chronicle to investigate and run some articles on this. And you can see that during the time that these investigations were conducted, there's a picture of Ted Bentz alongside Ed Bentz, an innocent question mark above his head. In other words, the media is beginning to catch on to the story. Finally, at a parole hearing in Marquette, Michigan, in November 1955, do the math, Ted found one more advocate. At a parole hearing, retired Chicago police officer John Campbell, remember him? Testified that Ted Bentz had sat in his police cruiser on the afternoon of August 18, 1933. Parole Board Chair Ross Pascoe announced that parole was granted immediately, and he said, if I had the authority, I would have granted you a full pardon. And so, on November 19, 1955, and I understand the picture is awful here, I found this picture through the Muskegon Chronicle, and some of you can probably help me get this thing looking better. But it's a picture under the head, above the headline, Bentz out of prison says he'll work for a full pardon. And it shows him in a new suit of clothes that he was given by the prison and a new suitcase walking out of prison after serving 21 years. He lived the rest of his life in Tacoma, Washington, and you'll recall that's where Ed ended up also, running a small bait shop. And I pulled up these pictures. One of them is sort of ironic. You can see that little sign by the fish. It says, caught on Bentz flies. I don't know if they're talking about fishing or criminal law there. I have attempted to get family members, and I think I've traced some of them who I believe are family members. And I've said I want to talk about his innocence. And I can't get anyone to talk to me. My guess is it's a chapter they would just as soon put behind them. So, that's my story. And I'm not altogether sure what lessons we can learn from all of this. I'm not sure that you have to walk away from any of this smarter than you were before. I think it's probably a good reminder for those of us involved in law enforcement or in the courts, or those who were, that the Constitution is just not a list of legal technicalities designed to excuse the guilty. It's a list of protections. And doing an end run around the Constitution, or at least not having the law to appropriately interpret the Constitution, cost a man 21 years of his life. Now, I say 21, he probably would have gotten 3 to 5 for laundering, which he was in fact guilty of, obviously. But still, not robbery. Or might it simply be worthwhile to hear the stories of the past? Is that in and of itself its own reward? I tend to think it is, to think about, talk about a time long ago that maybe we've never heard of before, and that will be lost in history if we don't tell those stories. And I'm not saying, hey, it has to be me telling this story. You've got your own stories. And if the lesson is tell the stories of your generation to the next generation, then do it, I think. I thank you for your attention. And I don't know where I am time-wise on this, but my understanding is that you might have some questions or comments, or Jan, whatever you want me to do.
Where's
Go ahead.
over here?
Doesn't matter. I just have a question regarding the car.
Wait for the mic,
Oh,
please.
wait for the mic.
Well, I can hear you, sorry.
I have a question
Hold it right
about,
up to your mouth.
I have a question about, yeah, that's when I was doing karaoke. About the car that was used. Was that something that the cleric, who was the radical cleric, was that indeed stolen, or was he providing, was he an accessory to some of these things by loaning the car or giving the car to these people?
That's a good question. There's no question the car itself was stolen. They eventually traced that back to the Chicago area from where it had been stolen. I don't have anything to say that Coughlin was involved in the theft or the delivery.
That's a long history of Rosema's in Grand Haven for sheriff. I knew Gary, and
Oh,
this is
okay.
part of his family?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, thanks.
This is just a quick comment. I gave the talk this morning. Not only did we both talk about the 1930s, we are both Christian high graduates, I think in the same year.
You were 1986?
1980, right.
I'm trying here. I thought that was kind of a smooth line. Wasn't it? Pretty good?
I remember you as a basketball player.
Yeah, I did that for a while.
Yes.
Good to see you.
This is just a question of clarification of names. Earlier in your story, and I don't remember how it fit, there was somebody with the last name of Bodema, Gloria Bodema. She had a child, and what?
Bonema, B-O-N-N-E-M-A. Lori was her first name. Whether that was, I mean, that's the way it was in the Tribune. It could have been Gloria, and they had children. Is that a family, maybe?
You know, I just remember Bodema from Grand Haven, Spring Lake.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if that was, he's passed away now, Jerry Bodema. And
It could be,
and I wondered if that was, he was the child in the stroller.
could be.
Oh, my. Yeah, oh, my.
If there are any morticians among us, I wonder if they routinely keep guns in there. Always in our furniture store.
Is the bank still there, and can you still go see those pockmarks?
There is a structure on the bank now, but it's or on the property, I should say, but it's a completely new building. So no, you cannot see the pockmarks. What I have been told recently, and this may be my next project, is that the foundation area and a basement cellar still exists from the original structure. And there's some stuff down there, which makes me want to go in there and find out what the stuff is. We'll see. But no, it is a bank now, but a completely new structure. Yeah.
This is just a comment, but I noticed in the Trib article that I think it was the Bonema's car was abandoned on that, they were searching the dunes around Pigeon Creek. And I'm very glad that we didn't live there then, because Rod and Pat and I all live about a quarter of a mile from Pigeon Creek on the dune.
Yeah, that was, well, you know the area. Especially at that time, it was a good place to dump a car.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was in the boonies.
Yeah, right.
If there's no other questions, well, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Yeah, if I need a ride, I'll let you know.